Tom woke up to the familiar sound of his alarm clock blaring obnoxiously in the quiet of his small, tidy home. He rubbed his eyes, stretching his arms above his head as he sat up. Another day as the mailman awaited him, a routine he had grown fond of over the years. The sun peeked through his window, casting a warm glow that filtered through the curtains, and he took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. After a quick shower and a hearty breakfast, Tom donned his postal uniform, dark blue pants and a matching shirt, before stepping outside. The air was crisp, the warmth of the sun battling the lingering chill of early morning. He grabbed the mailbag hanging by the door, feeling its comforting weight as he set off down the tree-lined street of his neighborhood. Tom had built a rapport with many of the residents. He was known for his cheerful demeanor and friendly waves, often stopping to chat for a moment or two. Today, however, as he walked along the familiar path, a sense of unease shadowed his thoughts. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what was amiss, but it was a nagging feeling that settled in the pit of his stomach. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," he greeted an elderly man watering his garden. "Morning, Tom. How's your day shaping up?" Mr. Thompson replied, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Can't complain. Just another day delivering smiles," Tom said, flashing a grin. As he continued on his route, the feeling of discomfort lingered. He brushed it aside, attributing it to a long week of work. But as he approached Mrs. Henderson's house, the sense of foreboding intensified. Mrs. Henderson was a sweet, elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for years. Tom always looked forward to his daily interactions with her, where she would share snippets of her life, from her beloved garden to her late husband's fishing tales. Today, however, as he neared her porch, he noticed her sitting there, her hands resting on her lap, staring blankly at the ground. Her normally vibrant dress appeared a bit rumpled, and her usually cheerful demeanor seemed to have faded. Tom raised his hand in a friendly wave, but she didn't respond. "Mrs. Henderson?" he called out, concern lacing his voice. Still, there was no reply, just the faint rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Tom hesitated, feeling a knot form in his stomach. It was unusual for her to be so lost in thought, especially when he had always been met with a smile or a story. He stepped closer, trying to gauge her mood. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. At last, she turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. There was a flicker of recognition, but it was overshadowed by a cloud of worry that seemed to hang over her. "Oh, hello, Tom," she said, her voice distant and shaky. "Just thinking." "Thinking about what?" He was genuinely curious, but he sensed that this wasn't the usual lighthearted banter they shared. "Just life, I suppose," she replied, her gaze dropping back to her hands. Tom's heart ached for her. He had seen her many times, always full of stories and laughter, but today, she seemed like a shadow of her former self. He took a step onto her porch, closer to her. "Do you want to talk about it?" No, it's fine," she said, waving her hand dismissively, but Tom noticed the way her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Okay, but I'm here if you need anything," he offered, forcing a smile that felt uneasy on his lips. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something on her pants, stains that looked oddly out of place against the bright fabric. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that they were dark and smeared, almost as if, "Mrs. Henderson, are you?" he started, but the words caught in his throat. He felt a surge of concern, a protective instinct rising within him. "I'm fine, really. Just a bit clumsy today," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Tom nodded slowly, feeling a heavy weight in his chest. He knew he should leave, but something deep inside him urged him to stay, to dig deeper into the cracks that had formed in her cheerful facade. She had always been such a pillar of strength in the neighborhood, and now seeing her like this troubled him more than he could articulate. "All right, but I'll check in on you later, okay?" he said, forcing himself to step back, trying to shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. "Thank you, Tom," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the image of those stains from his mind. They felt like a warning sign, an indication that something was terribly wrong. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, revealing a glimpse of a hidden world he had never considered. The rest of his route felt mechanical. He delivered letters and packages, greeted familiar faces, but his mind was only half focused on the task at hand. The nagging feeling from earlier morphed into a gnawing concern, compelling him to consider what he could do to help Mrs. Henderson. After finishing his deliveries, Tom found himself standing outside her house again. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, and he felt an unshakable urge to check on her. He told himself it was only a quick visit, a friendly gesture, but deep down, he knew that his heart was invested in this moment. He approached the porch with cautious steps, taking a deep breath before knocking on the door. "Mrs. Henderson?" he called out, his voice echoing slightly. "It's Tom, your mailman." Silence filled the air, and the unease crept back in. He knocked again, a little harder this time, and waited, straining to hear any sign of life within. "Mrs. Henderson." When there was still no answer, he felt a surge of panic. He peered through the window, heart racing as he scanned the dimly lit room. That's when he saw her, sitting on the floor, her back to him, seemingly unaware of her surroundings. "Mrs. Henderson," he shouted, voice laced with urgency. As if jolted from a trance, she turned her head slightly, her expression blank. Tom's heart sank. This wasn't a mere case of distraction. Something was seriously wrong. Without thinking, he pushed the door open, finding it surprisingly unlocked. "Mrs. Henderson," he called again, stepping inside. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and an unsettling smell wafted through the house. "Are you okay?" he asked, rushing to her side. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and he could see now that her clothes were disheveled and the stains on her pants were far more pronounced. They were dark, unmistakably grim, and he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. "Tom, she started, her voice trembling. "Sure, it's all right," he replied, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm here. Let's get you some help." He fished his phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking as he dialed 911. "Yes, I need an ambulance," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "There's an elderly woman. I think she needs immediate assistance." As he spoke to the operator, he couldn't help but glance back at Mrs. Henderson. She seemed so small, lost in her own world, and for a moment he felt a surge of helplessness. How had he not seen the signs before? How had he missed the pain hidden beneath her cheerful exterior? "Stay with me, Mrs. Henderson," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Help is on the way." She nodded, though her eyes were distant, and Tom felt a sense of urgency to reach her. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked gently, trying to coax her back to the present. "I'm just tired, Tom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Okay, let's just focus on breathing for now. I'm right here," he reassured her, feeling a sense of protectiveness wash over him. As he waited for the paramedics to arrive, Tom found himself reflecting on the moments they had shared. He thought of the stories she had told him, the warmth in her laughter, and the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of her husband. In that moment, he realized how little he truly knew about her life. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached. Tom's heart raced, a mix of relief and anxiety coursing through him. He had taken the first step to help her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to uncover about Mrs. Henderson's life, about the hidden struggles behind those friendly smiles. As the paramedics burst through the door, Tom felt a sense of weight lift from his shoulders, but the questions remained. What had led her to this moment? And how could he help her reclaim the life she once had? The answers danced tantalizingly out of reach, but one thing was certain. He would not turn his back on Mrs. Henderson again. Tom stood outside Mrs. Henderson's house, his heart racing. The day had turned into an unsettling puzzle that he couldn't quite piece together. He had returned under the guise of delivering a package, but the urgency driving him was far more pressing than that. He had seen the stains on her pants earlier, the way they seemed to tell a story of neglect and perhaps deeper issues that he barely understood. Now he stood before the familiar porch, the sun casting an eerie glow over the scene, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever he might find inside. As he approached the door, the peculiar smell wafted from the house and wrapped around him like an unwanted embrace. It was a mix of something stale, a hint of something sweet yet rotten, and he could almost taste the heaviness in the air. Tom knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the stillness. "Mrs. Henderson? It's Tom, your mailman," he called out, his voice sounding more uncertain than he intended. Silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. He knocked again, a little louder this time, his knuckles rapping against the weathered wood. A sense of dread began to creep into his mind. He stepped back, squinting through the window. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn tight. He could see the outline of Mrs. Henderson sitting on the floor, her frail figure dwarfed by the surrounding shadows. "Mrs. Henderson," he shouted, panic rising in his chest. "Are you all right?" His heart sank as he saw her head droop slightly, as if she were lost in a world far removed from reality. Tom's instinct screamed at him to act, to do something, anything. He glanced around, half expecting someone to appear and tell him that he was overreacting, that everything was fine. But the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt ominous. With a sudden burst of resolve, Tom decided to enter the house. He pushed the door open, the creaking sound echoing like a death knell. Stepping inside, he was immediately hit by the odor, more pronounced now, as if it had been lingering in the air for days. "Mrs. Henderson?" he called again, his voice trembling slightly. There was still no response, and he took a cautious step forward. The living room was cluttered, filled with stacks of old newspapers and boxes that seemed to have been untouched for years. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that managed to pierce through the curtains. As Tom moved further in, he saw more stains on the floor, dark patches that seemed to spread like secrets waiting to be uncovered. His heart raced as he approached Mrs. Henderson, who remained seated, her back against the wall. "Mrs. Henderson?" He knelt down beside her, concern etching deep lines on his brow. "Are you okay?" He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, and she flinched, her eyes fluttering open. They were glazed, distant, as if she were staring right through him. "Tom?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that you?" "Yeah, it's me. I was worried about you." He looked closely at her face, the lines of age deepening, her skin looking pale and drawn. "What happened? Do you need help?" She blinked several times, struggling to focus on him. "Help? No, dear. I'm just tired. So tired." A weak smile flitted across her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. Tom's stomach twisted at the sight. "Mrs. Henderson, you really need to see a doctor. You're not well," he urged, his voice firm yet gentle. "Let me call someone." "No, no doctors," she exclaimed suddenly, her voice rising in alarm. "I don't need them. I'm fine." But the way she said it, the frantic look in her eyes, told Tom otherwise. Tom took a deep breath, trying to keep his own panic at bay. "You're not fine, Mrs. Henderson. Look at you. You're sitting on the floor," and he gestured to the stains on her pants, the evidence of something much more serious than mere tiredness. "This isn't right." She looked down, a flicker of shame crossing her features. I didn't want to bother anyone." Her voice trembled, and Tom felt a pang of empathy. He could see now that this was more than just physical neglect. It was a battle against loneliness and despair that had worn her down. "Bother? Mrs. Henderson, you could never bother me. I care about you," he said earnestly, feeling the weight of emotion pressing on him. "Please, let me help you." For a moment, she seemed to consider his words, her gaze softening. "You're such a good boy, Tom. Always so kind." But then, the moment passed, and her expression hardened again. "But no doctors. Promise me." He hesitated, torn between her wish and the reality of her condition. "All right, but at least let me help you get up. You can't stay here on the floor," he said gently. She seemed to relent, and with his help, she slowly rose to her feet, wobbling slightly as if the act had drained her of the last of her strength. Once she was standing, Tom took a step back to assess the situation. "Let's get you to the couch, okay?" He guided her slowly, carefully, knowing that any sudden movement could send her spiraling back down. As she sank into the worn cushions, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. With Mrs. Henderson settled, he took a moment to look around the room again, his heart heavy with concern. The clutter was overwhelming, but it was more than that. There was a sense of abandonment that lingered in the air. "Do you have any family around? Children? Friends?" he asked gently. She looked down at her hands, wringing them together as if she were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. I had family once, she murmured. But they're all gone now. Just me and my memories. Tom felt a lump form in his throat. You don't have to be alone, Mrs. Henderson. I'm here for you. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Tom, you're a good boy, but you have your own life to live. You shouldn't waste it on an old woman like me. Don't say that. His voice was firm, but there was a softness to it that he hoped would reach her heart. You're not a burden. If anything, you've taught me so much just by knowing you. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang, breaking the heavy moment between them. Tom turned toward the sound, feeling a flicker of anxiety. I'll be right back, he said, moving toward the door. As he opened it, he was met by a delivery man holding a box. Package for Mrs. Henderson, the man said, looking past Tom into the dim interior of the house. Yes, it's for her, Tom replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He turned back to Mrs. Henderson, who had managed to sit up straighter on the couch. It's a package. Want me to bring it to you? She nodded slowly, her expression shifting to one of curiosity. Tom took the box from the delivery man and brought it inside, setting it on the coffee table in front of her. What is it? She asked, peering at the box as if trying to remember what she might have ordered. I don't know. Let's find out, he said, carefully opening the flaps. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age and filled with memories of a lifelong past. Wow, these look important. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened as she reached out to touch the edges of the photographs, her fingers trembling. Those are my family, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I haven't seen these in years. Tom watched as she took each photograph out, her face illuminated with a mix of joy and sorrow. There were images of a younger Mrs. Henderson, surrounded by children and a man who must have been her husband. In each picture, she looked vibrant and full of life, a stark contrast to the frail woman sitting before him now. Where did these come from? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure. Maybe a family member sent them? Tom suggested, but he could see that the memories were flooding back, and he was afraid to interrupt her reverie. She smiled softly, lost in the past. I remember this day. We went to the beach, and the kids were so excited. They splashed in the water and chased seagulls. I felt so alive then. Her voice trailed off, and Tom felt a pang of sadness for the life she had lived, the joy that had been replaced by solitude. Mrs. Henderson, he started, but she held up a hand, silencing him. Let me have this moment, Tom. Please. He nodded, respecting her wish, but inside he felt a storm brewing. He wanted to know more about her life, to understand the woman behind the fading photographs. What had happened to her family? Why had they left her alone in a house that felt so heavy with sorrow? As she carefully examined each photograph, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming urge to protect her. The stains on her pants. Tom stood outside Mrs. Henderson's house, his heart pounding in his chest. The paramedics had just rushed inside, their voices muffled yet urgent, echoing through the front door like distant thunder. He rubbed his hands together to ward off the chill that had settled deep within him, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The sight of Mrs. Henderson in such a state had shaken him to his core. Through the small window by the door, he caught glimpses of the paramedics working methodically, their faces etched with concentration. He strained to hear any information, but the only sounds that penetrated the thick walls were the faint beeping of medical equipment and the hushed voices of the responders. The air around him felt heavy, thick with the weight of uncertainty. A knot formed in his stomach as he imagined the worst. Then, breaking through his anxiety, he heard something, a muffled cry, a sound of distress that sent a jolt of panic coursing through him. Mrs. Henderson, he shouted instinctively, though he knew she couldn't hear him. He felt helpless, anchored to the spot as if his feet had sunk into concrete. The thought of her alone, in pain, made him ache with sorrow. He had always viewed her as a fixture in the neighborhood, a woman of resilience and spirit. But now, her vulnerability was stark, and it terrified him. Tom, a familiar voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. It was Jake, one of the paramedics, emerging from the house with a serious expression. Tom's heart raced as he approached, desperate for news. Is she okay? What's happening? Tom asked, his voice laced with worry. Jake took a deep breath, his brow furrowed. She's stable for now, but she's been living in pretty dire conditions. He gestured for Tom to step back as the other paramedics wheeled out a stretcher, Mrs. Henderson lying on it, her frail form surrounded by medical equipment. Tom's eyes widened in horror as he took in the sight. Mrs. Henderson's face was pale, her eyes closed as if she were lost in a dream. The stains on her pants were now a shocking reminder of the neglect that had plagued her life. What do you mean by dire conditions? He pressed, still unable to comprehend how things had spiraled so quickly. Let's just say she hasn't been taking care of herself, Jake replied, his tone softening. We found some signs of neglect in the house. Food left out, dirt everywhere. It looks like she's been struggling for a while now. We'll need to get her to the hospital for a full evaluation. Tom felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had delivered mail to her for years, always exchanging pleasantries and light-hearted banter. How had he not noticed the signs? I should have checked on her sooner. I thought she was just going through a rough patch. Sometimes people hide their struggles, Jake said, placing a reassuring hand on Tom's shoulder. You did the right thing calling us. She'll get the help she needs now. As they loaded Mrs. Henderson into the ambulance, Tom felt a mix of relief and sorrow. He wanted to scream, to shake her awake, to tell her that he was there for her. But all he could do was watch as the doors closed, sealing her inside the vehicle that would take her away from this place. The sirens wailed to life, cutting through the stillness of the neighborhood, and Tom felt a sense of finality as the ambulance sped away. Still in a daze, he turned to Jake, who was gathering his equipment. Can I go to the hospital? Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, of course. You should go, Jake replied, giving him a nod. It might be good for her to see a friendly face when she wakes up. Tom thanked him and hurried to his truck, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. As he drove to the hospital, he replayed the moments of the day in his mind. Mrs. Henderson had always been so vibrant, so full of life. The thought of her suffering in silence gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed her somehow. Arriving at the hospital, Tom rushed through the sliding doors, his heart racing. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the faint sounds of beeping machines and hushed conversations. He approached the front desk, where a nurse looked up from her computer screen, her expression neutral. I'm here to see Mrs. Henderson, Tom said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within. Do you have a relationship with her? The nurse asked, her tone clinical. I'm her mailman, he replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. I've been delivering her mail for years. I was concerned about her today and called for help. The nurse's expression softened slightly. All right, I'll let you know when she's settled in. It may take some time. Tom nodded, grateful for the nurse's understanding. He took a seat in the waiting area, the fluorescent lights buzzing above him. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as he anxiously tapped his foot, his mind racing with questions about Mrs. Henderson's condition. What had she been going through? Why hadn't she reached out for help? The answers eluded him, leaving a hollow ache in his chest. Finally, the nurse returned, motioning for him to follow her. She's in room 302. You can go in for a few minutes, but she's still a bit disoriented. Tom's heart raced as he made his way down the sterile hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting a harsh glow on the pale walls. He paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady himself before stepping inside. Mrs. Henderson lay in the hospital bed, her frail form dwarfed by the white sheets. An IV drip hung beside her, and a heart monitor beeped steadily, a reminder of the life still pulsing within her. Her eyes fluttered open as he entered, and for a moment, Tom felt as if he had stepped into a dream. Tom, she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Henderson, it's me, he said, rushing to her side. I'm so glad you're awake. She blinked slowly, confusion clouding her features. What happened? I don't remember. You collapsed at home. The paramedics came, and they brought you here, he explained gently, trying to keep his voice calm. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, and she frowned. I didn't mean to worry anyone. I lost track of time. Tom felt a pang of sadness at her words, the weight of them pressing down on him. You don't have to apologize. I should have checked on you sooner. I've been so caught up in my own routine that I missed the signs. Mrs. Henderson looked away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's easy to feel invisible, Tom. I didn't want to be a burden. I thought I could manage. But you don't have to manage alone, he insisted, his voice firm. You have people who care about you. I care about you. She met his gaze, and for a moment, the wall she had built around herself seemed to crack. It's just life has been difficult. I've lost so much over the years. It's hard to let anyone in. Tom's heart ached for her, for the pain she had endured in silence. You don't have to face it alone anymore. I want to help you. Whatever you need, I'm here. Mrs. Henderson smiled weakly, a flicker of hope igniting in her eyes. Thank you, Tom. It means more than you know. As they talked, Tom learned about her life, about the family she had lost, the friends who had drifted away, and the loneliness that had settled into her bones. Each story she shared felt like a thread unraveling, revealing the tapestry of her life, woven with love and loss. Tom realized how little he had known about her, how easy it had been to overlook the struggles of those around him. The connection they shared deepened with each passing moment, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose swelling within him. But as their conversation continued, the weight of her past loomed ever larger. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, hidden beneath the surface like a dark current. And as he sat by her side, he vowed to uncover the truth, to help her heal, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Mrs. Henderson, if you're comfortable, I'd like to help you get whatever support you need when you leave here. Maybe some home health care or whatever it takes to make sure you're okay, he suggested, his voice steady. She looked thoughtful, her gaze distant, as if she were weighing the possibilities. I appreciate that, Tom, but it's complicated. I don't want to burden anyone with my past. Your past doesn't define you, he urged gently. You deserve care and support. We can work through this together. For a moment, she remained silent, her eyes searching his as if she were trying to decipher his sincerity. Finally, she nodded slowly. I'll think about it. As Tom left the hospital that day, he felt a sense of determination settle within him. He had seen the fragility of life in Mrs. Henderson's eyes, and he couldn't let her slip away into the shadows. She deserved a second chance. Tom stepped softly into the sterile, fluorescent-lit room of the hospital where Mrs. Henderson lay, her frail body covered by a thin, white sheet. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of flowers from a nearby vase. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the sight of someone he had come to care for deeply in such a short time. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor provided a steady backdrop to the unsettling silence. Mrs. Henderson, he called gently, approaching her bedside. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing their once bright blue now dulled by fatigue and sorrow. Tom, she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. Is that you? Yes, it's me, he replied, pulling a chair closer and sitting down. How are you feeling? She tried to chuckle, but ended up coughing instead, a weak smile breaking through her pallor. Well, I suppose I'm better than I was. Thanks to you, dear. Tom felt a warmth spread through him at her words. I'm just glad you're awake. I was really worried about you. Mrs. Henderson's gaze drifted to the window, the afternoon sun casting warm rays that danced across her bed. You know, Tom, the last few years have been hard. I've lost my way, lost so much, she said, her voice trembling. Tom leaned in, his heart aching for her. You can talk to me about it if you want. I'm here to listen. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers fiddling with the edge of the blanket. It's hard to share. People see me as this old woman who doesn't have much to say. But I've lived a life filled with memories, some good, some not so much. Please, Mrs. Henderson, you're more than just an elderly lady to me. You're a person with a story. I'd like to know. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, she began. I was a young woman once, full of dreams. I had a husband, and we were happy. We had plans to travel, to see the world together. But life had other ideas. She paused, her eyes becoming misty as she recalled distant memories. One day, he didn't come home. A car accident. Just like that, my world crumbled. I was left alone with nothing but our memories. Tom felt a lump form in his throat. I'm so sorry. That must have been incredibly hard. It was, she admitted, wiping a tear from her cheek. I thought I could move on, but I never really could. I became so lonely that I pushed everyone away. Friends, family, even my own children. They tried to help, but I didn't want their pity. Tom shifted in his seat, feeling an overwhelming urge to reach out and hold her hand, to let her know she wasn't alone anymore. You don't have to be lonely, Mrs. Henderson. I'm here. I want to help. She turned her gaze back to him, her expression softening. You're a kind man, Tom. I see that now. You've been a bright spot in my dark days. But it's not just loneliness that weighs on me. It's the things I've done to survive. What do you mean? He asked, intrigued but wary of where the conversation might lead. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she held the blanket tighter. Sometimes, to survive, we make choices that haunt us. I made mistakes, Tom. I lost sight of who I was. I let my pain consume me. Tom felt a shiver run down his spine. You don't have to carry that burden alone. Sharing your story might help. Mrs. Henderson stared at him, a flicker of hope igniting in her tired eyes. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to let go of some of that pain. It's just, I don't know if I can face it all. You're stronger than you think, he encouraged gently. You've survived this long. You can face whatever comes next. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly. When my husband died, I became obsessed with keeping his memory alive. I lost myself in it. I thought if I could just hold on to the past, maybe it would bring him back somehow. Tom nodded, feeling a connection forming between them, a bridge built on shared understanding. You loved him very much. More than I can explain, she replied, her voice breaking slightly. But in trying to hold on, I lost everything else, my family, my friends, my health. They all slipped through my fingers, and I was left with nothing but memories and regrets. He observed the pain etched into her features, the way her eyes seemed to search for something in the distance. What about your children? Don't they want to see you? She looked down, her gaze heavy with sorrow. They tried to reach out, but I pushed them away. I didn't want them to see me like this. I wanted to protect them from my sadness. I thought it was for the best. But it's not too late, Tom interjected gently. You can reach out to them. You can let them back in. Mrs. Henderson's eyes glistened with unshed tears. What if they don't want me? What if I've lost them forever? You won't know unless you try, he urged, feeling the urgency in her words. I can help you if you'd like. I can be there for you when you make that call. A small smile broke through her sadness. You really are a good man, Tom. I wish I had someone like you in my life years ago. You have me now, he promised, his heart swelling with determination. You're not alone anymore. They sat in a comfortable silence, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. And for the first time in a long while, Mrs. Henderson seemed to find a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Tom, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. You've given me something to think about. As they continued to talk, Tom shared stories of his own life, his dreams, his fears, and how he had always wanted to make a difference in the lives of others. Mrs. Henderson listened intently, her eyes widening with interest. In their exchange, walls began to crumble, and the connection between them deepened. Hours slipped by without either of them noticing. Eventually, Tom stood up, feeling a sense of urgency to check on her condition. I should let you rest now, but I'll be back tomorrow. We can talk more then. Mrs. Henderson reached out and grasped his hand, a fragile yet firm grip. Please promise me you'll return. I promise, he said, squeezing her hand gently. You're important to me now. As he left the room, Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled upon something monumental, a chance to help someone heal, to mend the fractures of a broken life. But when he returned home later that evening, a strange unease settled over him. The house felt emptier than usual, and as he sorted through the mail, a particular envelope caught his eye. It was addressed to him, the handwriting familiar yet unsettling. Tom ripped the envelope open, his heart racing as he unfolded the note inside. The words were cryptic, almost frantic. "Tom, there are things you don't know about me. Things that could change everything. Meet me at the old park bench tomorrow at noon. I'll explain everything. M." His brow furrowed as confusion washed over him. Who was M? And what could they possibly want to tell him? The note slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor as anxiety twisted in his stomach. He stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the letter heavy in his hands. A pulse of dread coursed through him. What secrets could Mrs. Henderson be hiding? He had only just begun to scratch the surface of her life, and now there was a mysterious figure urging him to dig deeper. Tom's mind raced with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. He glanced at the clock, noting the time. The next day loomed large in his thoughts, a day when he might uncover truths that could shatter the fragile bond he had begun to form with Mrs. Henderson. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far more complex than he had ever anticipated. As he lay in bed that night, sleep evaded him, and the shadows of uncertainty danced around him, whispering secrets that only tomorrow might reveal. Tom stood at the entrance of the local library, the heavy wooden doors creaking slightly as they swung open. The familiar scent of old books and polished wood enveloped him, a comforting aroma that contrasted sharply with the turmoil swirling in his mind. He clutched the letter from Mrs. Henderson in his hand, the paper crumpled from his anxious grip. Each word echoed in his thoughts, urging him to uncover the truth behind the cryptic message she had sent him. "Dear Tom," it had started, written in her delicate, shaky handwriting. "There are things I've kept hidden, truths that need to be unearthed. You are the only one I trust to find them." The letter had stirred a sense of urgency within him, a feeling that he had to act quickly. He couldn't shake the image of her frail form lying in the hospital bed, her eyes clouded with the weight of her memories. Tom made his way to the history section, his heart racing as he scanned the shelves for anything that might relate to Mrs. Henderson. He was determined to find her story, to understand the pieces of her life that had brought her to this moment. He had always known her as a sweet, albeit lonely, old woman who would regale him with tales of her youth during his mail deliveries. But now, he sensed an underlying sorrow, a depth to her existence that he had never fully appreciated. He pulled a few books off the shelf, thumbing through them in search of names that sounded familiar. Hours passed, each page turned feeling like a step deeper into an uncharted territory. The library was quiet, the occasional rustle of paper the only sound breaking the stillness. Tom's fingers grazed over faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, each one depicting the neighborhood and its residents from decades long gone. "Can I help you with something?" A voice interrupted his solitude. Startled, Tom looked up to see a librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Her name tag read Linda. Yes, I'm looking for information on local history, specifically about a woman named Mrs. Henderson," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Linda raised an eyebrow, a hint of recognition flashing across her face. "Mrs. Henderson? You mean the elderly lady who lives on Maple Street? I believe she has quite the story, though it's a bit tragic." Tom's heart quickened. "Do you know anything about it?" Linda nodded, folding her arms as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. "Many years ago, there was a terrible accident involving her family. It's something the community talks about in hushed tones." "Accident?" Tom inquired, leaning in closer, desperate for more details. "Yes, it was a fire. Her husband and children, they didn't make it out. Mrs. Henderson was left alone to carry the burden of that loss. Ever since, she's been a recluse. It's heartbreaking, really," Linda explained, her voice tinged with empathy. Tom felt the air leave his lungs. He had sensed the pain behind Mrs. Henderson's eyes, but hearing it laid bare was something else entirely. "Do you have any records or articles that might give me more information?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded, leading him to a small archive room at the back of the library. "We have some old newspapers from that time. You might find what you're looking for." As Tom sifted through the clippings, a sense of dread washed over him. Each article painted a vivid picture of the tragedy that had befallen Mrs. Henderson. Flames engulfing the house, the frantic cries for help, the aftermath that left a community in shock. The details were harrowing, and he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility for her now. He found a particularly detailed article, the headline reading, "Family Perishes in House Fire, Community Mourns." The article detailed how the fire broke out late at night, trapping Mrs. Henderson's husband and children inside. It mentioned how Mrs. Henderson had been out running errands, returning to find her life irrevocably shattered. The article concluded with a note about the community rallying around her, offering support in the wake of such a profound loss. Tom's heart ached for her. He could only imagine the guilt and sorrow she must have felt, carrying the weight of her family's tragic fate alone. The more he read, the more he understood the stains on her pants, the remnants of a life lived in grief, a life where the past constantly haunted her. After hours of research, Tom closed the last newspaper, his mind swirling with new information. He knew he had to return to the hospital and share everything he had discovered with Mrs. Henderson. Perhaps by helping her confront her past, he could assist in her healing process. He rushed out of the library, the letter still clutched tightly in his hand. As he drove to the hospital, his mind raced with thoughts of Mrs. Henderson. Would she be angry that he had dug into her past? Would she feel exposed? Or would she welcome the chance to finally talk about the pain she had kept bottled up for so long? Arriving at the hospital, Tom hurried through the corridors, his heart pounding in his chest. He approached the nurse's station, hoping to confirm which room Mrs. Henderson was in. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Mrs. Henderson. Is she in her room?" he asked, trying to catch his breath. The nurse looked up from her computer, her expression shifting to one of concern. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Henderson was moved to a different facility for further treatment earlier today," she informed him gently. Tom's heart sank. "What? Why was she moved? Where is she?" The nurse frowned, typing something into her computer. "She's been transferred to the Maplewood Rehabilitation Center. It's a specialized facility that can provide her with the care she needs." "I'm sorry, I don't have any more information than that." Tom felt a rush of frustration mixed with fear. He had so much to share with her, and now she was gone. "Can you give me directions to Maplewood?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The nurse nodded and scribbled down the address, handing it to him. "Just take Route 32. It's about 20 minutes from here." "Thank you," Tom said, his mind already racing ahead to what awaited him at the new facility. He quickly got back into his car, the weight of the letter feeling heavier than ever. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was of the essence. Mrs. Henderson needed him now more than ever, and he would do everything in his power to be there for her. The drive felt interminable, the road stretching out before him like an endless ribbon of uncertainty. He thought about what he would say to her, how he would explain the findings that had changed his perspective on her life. Would she cry? Would she feel relief in finally having someone to share a burden with? Arriving at Maplewood, Tom parked and hurried inside, his heart racing with anticipation. The facility was bright and welcoming, a stark contrast to the weighty emotions that seemed to swirl around him. He approached the reception desk. A friendly woman greeted him with a smile. "Hi there, how can I help you today?" she asked, her tone cheerful. "I'm looking for Mrs. Henderson. I was told she was transferred here," Tom replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Of course. She's in room 204. Just down the hall to your left," the receptionist said, pointing the way. Tom thanked her and made his way down the corridor, his heart pounding with each step. He reached room 204 and paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He knocked gently before opening it, his heart pounding in his chest. The sight before him sent a chill down his spine. Mrs. Henderson sat in a hospital bed, looking frilier than before, her eyes distant. But beside her stood a man he had never seen before, a tall figure with an air of familiarity that sent alarm bells ringing in Tom's mind. "Who are you?" Tom asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The man turned, his expression shifting from surprise to something that resembled recognition. "I'm Nathan. I'm a relative of Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice soft yet firm. Tom's heart raced. "Relative? I don't understand. Mrs. Henderson never mentioned family." Nathan glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who sat silently, her gaze fixed on the window. There are things she hasn't shared, Tom. Things that have kept her from reaching out. But I'm here to help her reclaim her life. Confusion washed over Tom. Help her? What do you mean? She needs support, but his voice trailed off as he realized the implications of Nathan's presence. She's been through so much, and I've been searching for her for years, Nathan said, his tone filled with urgency. She deserves to know that she's not alone. We can help each other heal. Tom felt a surge of protectiveness for Mrs. Henderson. But I was here for her. I've been trying to understand her past, to help her confront the pain she's been holding on to, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. Tom, you don't understand. Her past is more complicated than you think, Nathan replied, his eyes earnest. She needs to confront not just the memories, but the people involved. I'm one of them. As Tom processed this revelation, the air in the room felt thick with tension. He had thought he was the one who. Tom pushed open the door to the new facility, his heart pounding in his chest. The sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with a hint of lavender from the wall-mounted air fresheners assaulted his senses. He had finally tracked down Mrs. Henderson, and the anticipation of seeing her again filled him with both hope and dread. However, as he stepped inside her room, his heart sank. Mrs. Henderson sat propped up in bed, her frail frame swathed in a hospital gown that seemed to swallow her whole. But it was the man beside her that caught Tom's attention. He stood tall, with a strong build and an air of authority that contrasted sharply with the vulnerable woman he had come to care for. The man was holding Mrs. Henderson's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles gently. Tom felt a jolt of confusion. Who was this man? His mind raced through the possibilities. Was he a doctor? A nurse? Or something more personal? As if sensing Tom's presence, the man turned to face him. The moment their eyes met, Tom's breath caught in his throat. Tom, the man said, his voice deep and steady. I'm David. I'm her nephew. Her nephew. Tom echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know she had family. David's expression softened as he looked back at Mrs. Henderson, who was smiling faintly at him. She's kept it a secret for a long time. I've been searching for her for years. After everything that happened, we lost touch, and I never stopped looking for her. Tom felt a mixture of emotions swirling within him: relief, confusion, and an unexpected sadness. He had been drawn to Mrs. Henderson, wanting to help her navigate her past. Now, he felt as if he was standing on the outside of a very personal reunion, a family connection he had never known existed. Is she okay? Tom asked, trying to mask the turmoil in his heart. I mean, physically? David nodded, his eyes shifting back to Mrs. Henderson. She's stable, but she's been through a lot. I think she just needs some time to adjust. Being here is a step in the right direction. Tom stepped closer, his gaze drawn to the gentle lines of worry etched across Mrs. Henderson's face. I'm glad you're here, he said genuinely. She's been through a rough patch lately. I'm not sure she would have made it without help. Thank you for looking out for her, David replied, his voice sincere. It means a lot to me. I didn't know she had a friend in the neighborhood. He glanced at her again, his expression shifting to concern. But she has secrets, things she hasn't told me either. I think we need to be careful. Tom's heart sank further. He had suspected there was more to Mrs. Henderson's story than she had revealed. What kind of secrets? He asked, his curiosity piqued despite the unease that knotted in his stomach. David hesitated, his brow furrowing as if weighing his words. There's a lot of pain in her past. Family issues, loss and danger. I think it has something to do with the life she led before all of this. She was trying to protect me, but now, he trailed off, looking helplessly at his aunt. Before Tom could ask more, a nurse entered the room, a clipboard in hand. Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. How are we feeling today? She chirped, brightening the atmosphere. Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him at her cheerful presence. Better, dear, now that I have company, Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice soft yet warm. She reached out, gesturing for Tom to come closer. Tom, come meet my nephew. Tom stepped forward, feeling an odd blend of warmth and apprehension. Hi, Mrs. Henderson. I'm so glad to see you, he said, forcing a smile despite the chaos brewing inside him. Tom, this is David, she said, pride evident in her voice. He's been searching for me. "Nice to meet you," Tom said, extending his hand to David, who shook it firmly. "I've heard a lot about you. Well, not a lot, but enough to know you mean a lot to her." David's expression softened again. "I'm just glad to finally find her." As they exchanged pleasantries, Tom's mind swirled with the implications of David's presence. He had thought he was the only one to care for Mrs. Henderson in her difficult time, but now he realized there was so much more to her story. She was not just the elderly woman he delivered mail to. She was part of a larger tapestry of family and history that he had yet to unravel. After the nurse left, the atmosphere shifted. David leaned closer to Tom, lowering his voice. "Listen, I don't want to alarm her, but we need to figure out what's going on. There are things from her past that she might still be in danger from." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I can't get into all the details right now," David said, glancing back at Mrs. Henderson, who seemed lost in thought. "But there are people who might not want her to be found. I need to ensure she's safe." Before Tom could respond, his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the caller ID. It was an unknown number, but something in his gut told him to answer it. "Hello," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Tom, you need to listen to me." The frantic voice on the other end sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. "Who is this?" he asked urgently. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that Mrs. Henderson's life is in danger. There are people looking for her, dangerous people. You have to protect her." Tom's heart raced as he processed the information. "What do you mean? Why is she in danger?" "Just trust me. You need to keep her close. Get her out of there if you can. I can't explain everything now, but time is running out." Before he could ask more questions, the line went dead. Tom stared at the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's wrong?" David asked, noticing Tom's pale face. "Someone just called me," Tom said, his voice shaky. "They said Mrs. Henderson is in danger. Dangerous people are looking for her." David's face hardened, his eyes narrowing in concern. "We need to move her. Right now." Tom turned to Mrs. Henderson, who was watching them with a puzzled expression. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice steadying, "we need to talk to you about something important." "What is it, dear?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "I think it's safer if we don't stay here much longer," Tom said cautiously. "There are things we need to discuss, and I don't want you to worry, but what?" she pressed, her eyes glinting with determination. David interjected. "There are some people from our past who might want to hurt you, Annie. We need to figure this out together, but we have to be cautious." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened, and Tom could see the fear flickering behind them. "I thought I had left all of that behind," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tom reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not alone in this anymore. We'll figure it out together." David nodded, his expression resolute. "We need to get you out of here, maybe to my place until we know more." As they discussed their options, a sense of urgency enveloped the room. Tom felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had stepped into a world he never knew existed, a world filled with shadows and secrets. But amidst the fear, he also felt a flicker of determination. He wouldn't let Mrs. Henderson face this alone. "Let's do it," Tom said, his voice steady. "We'll protect her, whatever it takes." The trio began to formulate a plan, and as they did, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the precipice of something monumental. The truth about Mrs. Henderson's past was about to come to light, and he was ready to face it, no matter the cost. To be continued.